Hey guys, my name is Colson Rosa, and welcome back to Seraphim Stories. So for this third author update, I kind of want to look back and reflect upon my first book, which is The Knights of Torin. And this book really started the entire series and my entire journey as a writer. So I want to give you guys some information about how I wrote it, what it meant to me, some of the things that I've learned from that original process. And I will say there's a little bit of a spoiler warning for some things in the book. I'm not going to be going into huge detail into the entire story because I want to leave some aspects of the story as a mystery for you new readers to then experience when you're getting to read it. But I may make mention to some of the events that take place in the Knights of Torin, just to give a greater description of what the book means to me and some of the things that happen in the book. So the first thing that I want to talk about when it comes to the Knights of Torin is revisions. This can be a scary concept, a scary idea, but I certainly was not a polished author with the first book that I was writing. I wrote it when I was actually 12 years old, so there was a lot of challenges into coming into my first book that I really wanted to write, but I didn't exactly know the best way to do that. It started as a school project, actually, and I was homeschooled, so we had a gap year in our English program, and my mom picked up a creative writing course. I fell in love with it, and the final project for that course was to write our own short story. That short story would later become The Knights of Torin, and this was a long, hard process that involved a lot of revisions. When I first started writing the book, I didn't have a plot line. I didn't have a clear sense of the story, and it went in like 10 different directions, and I wasn't sure where to even take the story. So when I was showing it to my mom and my dad just to get their thoughts on it, they kind of sat me down and said, if you really want to make this something bigger, something greater, more of a full story, there's a lot you're going to need to cut out. There's a lot you're going to need to add. You need to refocus the story toward one direction. So I probably had to drop about half the book that I had written at that point and rewrite it. But it paid off because it allowed me to then create my first novel, get it to the point where it was finished. And then, even though it was finished at that point in time, I would later come back about 2 years later when I was 14 and rewrite the book because it needed some added depth and added perspectives on a lot of the scenes. Some of the things that didn't quite tie together nicely like I was hoping that it would. Now, even the original book, I'm very excited about talking about because I think it was a great project, especially for only being 12 years old. You know there's going to be some minor mistakes or inconsistencies or things I wish happened better, but especially since I got to rewrite it, a lot of all the grammar mistakes were removed, and then also some of the mistakes that I found with the story were then cleared up, and those revisions really helped. Now, when I look back on the book, I recognize that I've grown a lot as an author since, but just because my work has continued to advance doesn't mean I'm not still incredibly fond of the place where it all started. Without this book, I don't know what would have happened to the rest of them. And there's still so many things I admire about the story, even though I look back sometimes and wonder if I would have done some things a little bit differently or added some scenes. But all that being said, you don't need to look back on your projects with self-criticism and doubt if anyone's going to like them, just because you as an author are thinking through maybe some additional elements the story could have had. The reader may not know about those elements, and the reader could just love your story for exactly what it is. And that's what I've seen so many of my incredible fans do with the Knights of Torin, is even though they'll read the later books and they'll see some greater depth in my ability as a writer, they'll look back at the first one and say, I'm still so glad I got to read this story. It's such an incredible story, and it may at times be a little bit rough around the edges, but at so many other times, it's just as polished as it needs to be. And a lot of books will then progress throughout the series to add depth into the stories, kind of like J.K. Rowling did with the Harry Potter series as they got longer and more advanced as her reader then aged with the stories themselves. So the next thing I want to talk about is more specific to the Knights of Torin, and that is world building. Young minds can sometimes have big ideas, and that's exactly what happened with me. I wanted to build an entire world of Amcronos. I was inspired by authors like Tolkien and Lewis and many other authors that took the time to really flesh out an entire continent or an entire world even. And that intrigued me so much, and I wanted to push and challenge myself and see if that was something I could do myself. So you can see in all of my books that there's a map at the start of the book. And not only does that map show the world of Amcronos, or more specifically the continent of Amcronos that is then set in the larger context of Amcronos, the Haven Realm, and some other different aspects of this world. But I wanted to showcase as many different locations within that map as possible. I find often that with people that are trying to world build too expansively without a clear trace of where the story is headed, they might develop a world, but it feels like we're only focusing on a tenth of it, and the rest of it is just kind of floating out there nebulously. But I really specifically wanted Amcronos to feel alive in as many different areas as I could, which meant the story naturally goes to many different locations throughout the world of Amcronos to showcase and highlight all of their interesting characteristics. And I specifically tried to make a lot of the areas very different from each other, just to showcase and highlight their different spins and takes on the world of Amcronos, which is so unique depending on what part of Amcronos you are in. The next thing that I want to talk about is realism mirroring creativity. Now, you could say, why don't you just say realism versus creativity? But I think the two can highlight and deepen each other. They don't have to fight against each other. What I wanted was a very fantastical setting, but a fantastical setting that is sort of grounded or anchored by characters that have struggles and emotions and war that is a mix of both heroic and painful. Because I feel like often war is just glorified in books without showing the pain that comes from these battles. That's something I really wanted to highlight, was the fact that even though this is a world full of imagination, and the Knights of Torin just begins the look into the imagination of this world, it gets so much more advanced as you move along to other books. But that sort of incredible imagination where you just get to escape into this world and learn from this unique, vivid, vibrant world that you never would have experienced before. Because it's more than just escapism, remember. It's learning from this world and then applying things you learn from these characters and this world to your own life. But it also then is interesting to see how, in that sort of creative world, I wanted it to be grounded and feel more relatable to characters that have a lot of flaws sometimes, or even if they're a little bit less flawed, they have very strong emotions toward what they've faced, what their friends are facing, and what they're going through. The next thing I then want to talk about is characters, backstory, and lifestyle. In the Knights of Torin, you'll see broken pasts, bonds of brotherhood, ranger ways, living life in a forest, kind of what that looks like. But then the lifestyle of so many of these characters has to change as they leave that context and move into a greater context. They're not willing to sit back. They want to get involved with the larger picture of what's happening in Amcronos. There are so many different characters that I love so deeply that over the course of the 5 books, their stories grow. In this warlike setting, there's not just going to be one person that's going to shine so much brighter than the rest where the other characters are just left. You're fighting as a team. You're fighting as a unit. So all of these characters' interactions with each other matter so deeply to the other characters because these are the people you're fighting alongside. These are the people that have become like brothers and sisters to you, or have become just people you can't lose in your life. Like Lavrin feels for Kyra, he just can't bear the thought of losing her, especially as the story progresses. And their backstories feed into the way they react to these lives that they're now living, because some of them have been in the forest their entire lives. Some of them, like Chan and Nadrian, are very new to forest lifestyle, so they much more easily can lose it to then pursue greater knighthood for the army of the King of Light, and pursue a greater challenge and a greater struggle where leaving their ranger ways means doing the right thing and fighting, especially for the northwest region of Amcronos that's looking to be taken over by Natas, but they're not going to let that happen without a fight. The next thing I want to talk about is these moments within the story where the characters feel something has to change. Their lives are thrown upside down by events that they've seen take place that they never could have imagined. Saberland shifting from this glorious city to one that's corrupt shocks them out of their normal routine, and their curiosity then, especially the curiosity of Lavrin and Calyx, leads them into tense encounters that challenge who they are as people, who they are as followers of the king, and they then decide, along with their new allies, that they cannot sit by any longer. And I think that's something really important to have in your story, is these moments where a character cannot sit by any longer. Something has to be done. The next thing I want to talk about with the Knights of Torin is how I wanted to introduce the fantasy slowly. This is similar to my point about realism mirroring creativity, but the first book, The Knights of Torin, focuses a little bit less on the mysteries of Amcronos and a little bit more on the personal stakes of the Northwest region in particular. This is the first region you're introduced to in the world of Amcronos, and it's a region that has a little bit less creatures in it, a little bit less mystery and fantastical elements to it that the characters are then going to explore and experience more as you get into the Slaves of Mazaron and some of the other books in the series. But I think there's so much that this book had to introduce that it's okay that we don't get the immediate context of the greater world of Amcronos at the start. You do get the greater context of Natas, some of the terrible things that he has done, some of the events that are starting to take place around the rest of Amcronos, but only a slight highlight, only an introduction, because you're then going to see more and more introduced as the books continue along. But the Knights of Torin specifically had so much that it needed to establish, so much it needed to start and begin with. I wanted to take a little bit more time with the characters, with their home that is the Northwest, that is falling apart at the seams and challenged by Zekern, challenged by Natas, that it could be completely lost, taken over by the darkness, and then where would the rest of their story be? Because the Northwest is going to be a bastion, an anchor for the rest of the series as the fight against Zekern, but more specifically against Natas, really intensifies. And when you're beginning a war, it's important to know the land you're fighting for, the land of Saberland, of Heightenmoor, of some of these incredible places that I really wanted the reader to feel could not be lost. And that's one of the reasons why I started to introduce the fantasy elements more slowly. I also didn't want to shock the reader by too many fantasy elements at once, so they can just begin learning about some of these creatures. They learn about the Lits, which are these small, almost bird-sized dragons. And then they start to see some other elements of fantasy with Macrollo, the talking leopard, who is such a fascinating character, even though we don't spend as much time with him in the story. His bravery and loyalty, sacrifice, his mindset of dedication, and being a willing servant of the King of Light, and just being so humble and grateful, not wanting to hurt anyone unless he absolutely has to. And that's just some of the introductions to the fantasy elements that we see then in the Knights of Torin. So the last thing I then want to talk to you guys about with this book, and please keep in mind that I'm not going into more detail about every single scene that takes place. I might do that in a later video, but I really want to encourage you guys to look into reading this book, and hopefully you've read through it before watching the deeper analysis I then do on the story later on this channel, where I go into a lot more spoilers about the book. I want to talk about beginning. Without this book, the rest never could have come. This book, kind of like I mentioned previously, had a lot that it needed to introduce, and I didn't want to cut short that introduction to quickly have the characters leave the Northwest region, because I think it's a fascinating region of Amcronos. But even more than that, there was plenty that needed to take place in the storyline, that it wasn't cut too short at, I believe, about 180 to 190 pages, which is certainly a story that needed to be told before then branching out into the rest of the world of Amcronos. And it's the start to a war, and a war needs to start somewhere. So with the defining battle for Heightenmoor, it then set the ball rolling for the entire rest of the war. But I also love that there's so much more to the story than just war. It isn't just a fantasy war novel. There's so much more about character relationships, family, what you're fighting for, just the exploration into this magical world, treating other creatures with respect and with just delight to get to see them, get to know them, get to learn about their cultures, and some deeper themes that run throughout the book of dedication and loyalty, hope in the midst of tragedy, and so many other just great ideas that need to be learned. Ideas of what does it look like to be a leader? What is leadership? What is dedication? How does intellect play into your dedication when you're trying to solve these vast problems and really think through what the best solution to them is? There are many other themes that I'll be talking about as I review these books, this 5-book series of the Tales of Amcronos. But I also just hope that you find this first book is short and accessible, easy to read. I try to make it as easy to read as possible through the wording used and the formatting of my books. Everything from the font size to the margins to the page size, I think really is the type of book I would want to be reading, just because of the ease and accessibility of reading it. But it also has a lot of rich depth that the more you dive into this book, the more you're going to get out of it. And I would love to hear your guys' thoughts, especially for those who have read the book. If you can find some of those deeper themes, deeper truths in the book, and then let me know what you found, and I'll let you know if you're on the right direction. And I'll let you know maybe about some of the other deeper intricacies, symbolism, knowledge, and lore that can be found in this incredible book. So thank you guys so much. I'm so glad that I got to talk to you guys about my book, and I really want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for supporting this channel by liking, subscribing, telling some of your friends who maybe love writing but just need a place to learn, or a community to talk about creative writing. I would love to be there for them and talk about this thing that I love. So thank you guys so much for watching the video. I hope you have a great day. God bless.